Hey, Lola. Hey, oftentimes I'll hear someone tell me about something that they're working on because we all work on things from time to time. And no matter how hard they try to make it work, it'll just feel like to them that they're not getting very far with it. And then they'll ask themselves, what am I doing here? Have you ever experienced anything like that before? I'm sure you probably have because we all have from time to time. Several times I've had somebody tell me about a friend or a family member, or maybe just an acquaintance of some kind that they were working with. And they were hoping to improve their relationship with this person in some way. Or maybe the friend or the family member or the acquaintance, maybe they had some kind of a problem or a struggle that they were dealing with. And so this person tries to do everything they can to help this person out. But no matter what they do or how hard they try, things just don't seem to improve with this other person. And the harder they try to help them out, uh, as the old saying goes, they feel like they're just kind of spinning their wheels a little bit. I don't know if we really use this phrase here all that much, but where I'm from, we would use a phrase called beating your head against a wall. Sometimes you can feel like it doesn't matter how hard I try at this particular thing or with this particular person, it just doesn't seem to be getting any better. And so a person like this might ask themselves, what am I doing? Is it even worth it to continue this? Have you ever experienced something like that before? Again, I would say you probably have at some point because we all have. So anyway, this morning we're going to be in in the book of Galatians, a small little book in the New Testament written by Paul. We're going to be in Galatians chapter 6. We're just going to be looking at a couple of verses, and you can take a look at it, turn there in your Bible. So I would encourage you to do that. What I really want to do this morning is I want us to reflect and remember something that's very, very important in life, but not just what is important, to think about why it's important, to remember, why are we here? How did we get here? To know your purpose in life. And this really, it really needs to be in the back of our heads pretty much all the time with everything that we do. To understand your purpose and to understand, why you're here. Well, it's a fundamental question that leads to the question of how did we get here in the first place? So as we look around the world that we're in, as we look at it scientifically, we look at the evidence that's here. And science, it's a wonderful thing that we have. Scientific development has come so far in the past 100 years or so. And I'm really glad about that. And you know why? I would much rather go to the doctor or go to a dentist and have one of our doctors and dentists of today work on me rather than a doctor or a dentist from like 150 years ago. Science has advanced, and I'm very, very grateful for that. But I think we have to remember something, that as good and reliable as modern science is, and so many things, there's a lot of things within science that are what we would call scientific theory. And that's just a fancy way of saying it's basically somebody's belief about something based upon the evidence that they're looking at. And that's why scientists within various scientific fields will often disagree about something. They'll have different scientific opinions or philosophies about the evidence that they're looking at. And I would just say in simple terms, they've got different beliefs about the field that they're looking at, or the evidence they're looking at within that scientific field. It's why scientific truths might seem to change over time. One year, science might tell you that certain foods are good for you. And then a few years later, science might tell you that those same foods aren't good for you. You've probably seen something like that before. So there's a lot of theory in science, a lot of beliefs in science. And that's not a bad thing. It's just important that we recognize theory for what it is. It's a belief. Um, Scientific theories, they're not all indisputable claims. I mean, they can be argued. I think theories are great, but sometimes we have to recognize them for what they are. Sometimes we might dispute that. It's a scientific belief, and so as we look at the evidence, um, we might have to think through that a little bit. So, in other words, just because a certain scientist makes a claim about something, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's always right. And that's the main point. And what I'm getting at is this: a scientific question that often comes up, or comes up occasionally, is how did we all get here? And an overwhelming claim in the scientific community, or in the secular world, is what's known as the naturalist theory. And that would be that this world and everything in it came about on its own, by chance. And so they would say there is no God that created everything. But I think we have to remember, saying that the world came about on its own by chance, that is someone's theory. That is their belief. Now, for me personally, when I look at the evidence of, of the world that we live in as close as I can, and of course, we don't have time to get into the details of it this morning, but for me personally, it takes a lot more faith to believe that the world came about on its own, by itself, than it does to believe that the world was created by a designer, by God. And so, for those of us who are convinced that we are creatures of God, creations of God, and those of us who believe that this God has reached out to us throughout history, to certain people, and communicated to us about who He is, and and the purpose that He has for us, and for His, us as His created people. Uh, and for those of us who believe that this message from God has been written down and preserved through all these years in the Bible, for those of us who are convinced of all of this, we learn from the Bible that we've got a relationship problem with God. It's what's called a sin problem. It's really a trust problem. We trust more in ourselves or in other things than we do in God. And so God came into this world as Jesus to rescue us from our problem, to bring us forgiveness, and to restore our relationship with Him. And He does this for everyone who trusts in His help, who trust in His message, who trust in His promises, who trust in His direction. And for those of us who trust in Jesus in this way, He tells us to follow Him, to live according to His ways, to let His love flow through you to others, to let others see God's love through you, and to encourage them to trust and follow Jesus as you do. And so by doing this, you do good to others. Now, we're going to be, as I mentioned a moment ago, we're going to be looking in the book of Galatians today. And as we come towards the end of the book of Galatians, or the letter of Galatians, the last chapter, chapter 6, Paul reminds us fellow believers in the region of Galatia to continue to love people by doing good to them. So let's just take a look at what he writes here. So we're going to be in Galatians chapter 6, And we're going to start in verse 9 and we're going to read to verse 10. So here is what Paul writes, chapter 6, starting in verse 9. He says, "And let us not grow weary of doing good, for in due season we will reap if we do not give up. So then, as we have opportunity, let us do good to everyone, and especially to those who are of the household of faith." Okay, so guys, his main message here in these verses is an encouragement to do good to others, to love them in this way. And so as we move towards the rest of what we're going to be talking about this morning, I want to offer three thoughts about doing good to others. And I want to spend just a little bit more time on this first one. But the first one I want to touch on is don't give up. Don't give up. Whenever we do things in life, we typically like the thought of feeling like we're making a difference. I mean, don't you? I mean, if you're going to pour your heart into something, if you're going to pour your time into something, your energy into something, don't you want it to make a difference? I mean, I think you do. I know I do. It's just that's normal to feel that way. And guys, when I was younger, and I was told to mow the grass, and um, I remember there might be certain times of the year when it was a little drier than others, and there might be big parts of the yard that wouldn't grow all that much. In fact, wouldn't hardly grow at all. And so, but I was told to mow the whole yard, and when I got to those sections of the yard, it was like I couldn't even tell where I'd mowed. And to me, they used to drive me nuts. Uh, I like to be able to see where I've been, and see that there's been something accomplished there. Um, Same thing whenever, uh, if I had to sweep a floor. Sometimes I might have to sweep a floor, and there really wasn't all that much dirt on it, and so I'm trying to sweep, and eventually make this big pile, and you're sweeping, and there's not anything that's piling up, and it's like I can't even tell where I've swept. I never did like that. As I was telling the people at the in the worship service this morning, I was tempted to go outside and grab a handful of dirt and throw it all over the floor so I could see where I'm sweeping up. Uh, yeah, I like to see where I've been. I like to see, you know, I like to see where there's been accomplishments on things. Now, earlier, a moment ago, I talked about how some people they might work hard to try to help somebody else, or they might work really hard to love on them in a certain way, and they might feel like, wow, what I'm doing to help is just it's not any good. It's not working. Why am I doing all this? How much longer should I continue to do this? Well, if we were to have read the beginning of chapter 6 in Galatians, we would have had maybe a little better context of what Paul was talking about here. He points out that we as people struggle through things. More specifically, we as fellow believers, and so it's important that we walk along beside of one another, to love one another, to help one another, to encourage one another, to support one another, to the way Paul puts it in Galatians, to bear one another's burdens, to remember that we are not above loving on somebody else because, guys, we have our own issues, right? That we struggle with. So it's not like I'm looking at this other person and they're struggling with something, and wow, I just don't know if I have too much more time for that person. Well, we all struggle with things, so we're not above them in that way. And guys, when we love on others and walk along beside of them, and we do our very best to help them, um, you know, it might take a long time for them to work through that struggle. You might even be reaching out to several people, and you're showing God's love to them. And you may not feel like you're making a big difference in their lives, and that might be discouraging to you. It might be deflating to you, and you might even feel like, you know what, I don't want to do this anymore. You might feel like giving up. But Paul says, don't do that. In verse 9 of the passage we read, Paul says, do not grow weary of doing good. When you do good to others, God is going to use it. God's using it in a positive way, but you may not be able to see it. Or maybe you can see it, but you're not seeing it because you're too focused on what you want to see. And Paul goes on to say, he says, in due season, we will reap. That is, even though you may not be able to see the positive things God's doing in somebody's life through you, in time, you're going to be able to see that positive difference. But guys, here's the key. You got to keep at it. Paul says, don't give up. Something I want to add here, and this is really implied in the text when you look at all of chapter 6. It's as if he's saying, remember why you do what you do. Remember that. Are you doing good to others to feel better about yourself? Are you doing good so that others will praise your accomplishments? In particular, what's going on here in Galatians is there were people that were telling believers. They said, "Hey, it's great to be a Christian, but you got to be circumcised. You got to be a Jew to be a Christian." And Paul's saying they're acting like they're doing the right thing, but really they're doing they had selfish motives behind it. Is what he's saying. Paul says, don't do that. Don't try to do good to others for selfish reasons. Paul talks about these people in Galatians that I just mentioned. But, what he's really hitting at is do good for the right reason. Do it because God wants you to do it. Love on them for that reason. And if you just so happen to see the positive differences in others that God does through you, then, man, that is great. That's awesome. It's encouraging. But if not, still do it. Do it simply because it's what Jesus wants. And that ought to be enough. But Paul does say, just to reiterate, if you stay at it, you should be able to see that positive difference in time. All right, here's a second thought about doing good to others, and that is look for opportunities. Look for opportunities. Now, in verse 10, Paul says, do good to others as you have opportunity. Certainly, you don't want to force yourself on somebody. But when you see an opportunity to love on someone, take it. Take advantage of that. Going, as you going through life, you might want to go out of your way to help somebody with some kind of a task that they're working on, or you might contact somebody to check up on them, see how they're doing. You might do that in person. You might give them a call, and with today's technology, you can do that. You can do a video chat, or you can do it the old-fashioned way on the phone. You might write them a note. Could be a text, could be an email, or could just be an old handwritten note. You can spend time with people. You can say all kinds of encouraging things to them. You can give somebody a listening ear. You can bring them material things. You can bring them things that are thoughtful. You can bring them things that provides them something useful. There's all different kinds of ways that we can love on people. And so when you see these opportunities, I would encourage you to do it as much as you can. But don't just seize the opportunities. Don't just do that. I would encourage you to look for them. And that's taking it to the next step, the next level, being intentional about it, and ask God to help you with it. Okay, so finally, here's a third thought about doing good to others, and that is especially do good to fellow believers. Especially do good to fellow believers. Now, in verse 10, Paul says, do good to everyone. And we should. We should do good to everybody. Everyone we come in contact with should be an opportunity in some way to show God's love. And I would encourage you to think about that. If we're not thinking about it, what are the chances that we're going to do it? Well, I think the answer depends on how much we're doing it in the first place. The more you allow God to work through you in this way, the more you're going to do it instinctively. And the less you think about it, well, you're probably, well, there may be an indication that you find yourself not doing it as much. But, I would just say the more you're doing it, the more you're doing it instinctively, the less you're going to have to think about it. But if you haven't been letting God work through you like this, uh, the more you're going to need to think about it intentionally. But I would say I think it's still important that all of us think about it intentionally at some level. But again, it is important that we do good to everyone. But Paul adds here, especially to those who are of the household of faith. In other words, especially to fellow believers. God wants you to do good to everyone, but he especially wants you to love one another. He wants you to love fellow believers, those in your church family. And this is very, very important to God. He created us to be a people of love. He's recreating us for that purpose. He's saving us for that. He's transforming us. And really that's to be our trademark as a people of God, followers of Jesus, those who love one another. One of the things that Jesus said, and this is in the Gospel of John, and I'm just kind of paraphrasing a little bit, but Jesus said the main way that people are going to know that you're my people is because of your genuine love for one another. My question to you is that true of you? When you love others, do you grow weary from doing that? And if so, have you considered why you're doing good for others? Is it possible that at times when you do good for others, that you do it for the wrong reason? These are things I think that we all need to ask ourselves and think about from time to time. It's good for us, good for all of us to think about that and question why we do what we do. As we close here, let me just say and encourage you, don't measure your impact in God's kingdom by the results you want to see. Rather, by how faithful you're being, because that's what God calls you to do. He doesn't necessarily call you to create results, but to be faithful to him and let him do mighty results that he wants to do through you. And you may not even be able to see what all those results are, but that you can trust him with it. And so, as we close here, let me ask you, how faithful are you to God's calling?